Your support keeps these stories alive. Like, subscribe, and ring the bell. I came into this world when my parents were barely old enough to drive. They were just 17, two kids who thought they had time to dream, to chase ambitions, to live carefree lives. But I crashed into their plans like a storm they never asked for. My father had a future mapped out in his mind: football scholarships, college games under the stadium lights, maybe even the possibility of going pro. He never let me forget it either. Over the years, he reminded me again and again that I had ruined that dream. To him, my very existence was the chain that shackled him to a gas station job and a name tag. And to a 17-year-old boy with dreams bigger than his hometown, that was the worst kind of prison. My mother wasn't much older, but where he seethed in anger, she folded under the pressure. She worked whatever jobs she could get: waitressing, cashiering, folding clothes in a department store, any shift that paid the bills. She didn't raise me as much as she handed me off because survival demanded it. For the most part, it was the old lady next door who became my babysitter. She was cranky, no doubt about it, but she had something my parents didn't: time and a strange kind of patience. She scolded me, sure, but she also listened when I talked. She knew my favorite cereal and noticed when I was sick. Funny how someone unrelated, living alone in her house filled with dusty furniture, gave me more warmth than the people who created me. My earliest memories of my father are of hugs or laughter. They're of him coming home smelling like gasoline, tossing his work shirt onto the couch, and sighing like life had already beaten him at 20. He'd crack a beer, sit in silence, and sometimes glance at me with that look, a mixture of resentment and exhaustion. If I asked for help with homework, he'd snap, "Figure it out yourself." If I tried to tell him about something good that happened at school, his eyes glazed over. And every so often, when the bitterness boiled over, he'd say it plainly: "If it weren't for you, I'd be playing football right now." I didn't fully understand what that meant as a kid, but the words stuck like thorns. I didn't ask to be here. I didn't ruin anything. But he made me believe for a long time that I was some sort of mistake walking around on two legs. When I was 6, my mother had my sister. That was the moment I became invisible. Before, I was neglected, but at least acknowledged. After my sister was born, all the scraps of affection I might have once received disappeared. My parents doted on her in a way they never did with me. She got the hugs, the soft voices, the bedtime stories. I got told to be quiet, to move over, to stop being a nuisance. It didn't take a genius, not even a 6-year-old, to see where I stood. Our 2-bedroom apartment turned into a battleground of space. At first, I shared a room with my baby sister, my bed tucked against the far wall. But as she grew, so did the narrative that I didn't belong. One day, my father tossed my blankets onto the couch in the living room and said, "You're a big boy now, you don't need your own room." And that was that. The living room couch became my bed for 2 years. I can still feel the springs pressing into my back, still hear the refrigerator humming at night, still remember the embarrassment when friends came over and realized I didn't even have a bedroom. My possessions could fit into a single plastic storage bin: clothes, school supplies, and an old beat-up Game Boy that I clung to like it was treasure. I think the only reason I didn't drown in loneliness back then was my grandparents. My father's parents lived across town, and every time I got to visit them, it was like stepping into another world. They treated me like I mattered, like I wasn't some burden they had to drag along. They remembered my birthday, they cooked me meals I actually liked, they asked me about school and listened to the answers. They gave me the kind of love I didn't know parents were supposed to give until I felt it from them. To me, they weren't just grandparents, they were lifelines. The turning point came when I was 10. My parents decided to move to another city, but there was a catch. The move didn't include me. I overheard the conversation, the way my father said it coldly, as if he were talking about leaving behind a broken piece of furniture. "He'll be better off with my folks anyway." My mother didn't argue. She never argued, she just nodded. Oddly enough, I didn't cry. I didn't beg them to take me. I felt relief, almost happiness. And when I finally went to live with my grandparents, it was like stepping into the life I should have had all along. For the first time, I had a real bedroom with a bed that was mine alone. My grandparents surprised me with a brand new N64 in 1996, something my parents would have never spent a dime on. That Christmas, they gave me a Game Boy Pocket too. It wasn't about the gifts, it was about the fact they thought about me, that they wanted to see me smile. The neighborhood where they lived had a handful of kids my age, and we became a little ragtag crew. We rode bikes until the sun went down, built forts out of old plywood, got muddy playing in the creek, and dared each other to do stupid things like shooting cans with pellet guns. For once in my life, I was just a kid. No resentment hanging over my head, no couch to crawl onto at night, no whispers about how unwanted I was. Just freedom. Looking back now, I realize that was the first time I felt genuine happiness, and it had nothing to do with my parents. In fact, it was the complete absence of them that made it possible. They dropped me off at my grandparents' door thinking they were offloading a burden. Instead, they gave me the family I always needed. Living with my grandparents was like stepping into a different universe, one where I mattered. Their house wasn't huge, but it was filled with warmth that I had never known before. My grandmother had this way of humming when she cooked, soft tunes that made the kitchen feel like the heart of the home. The smell of her biscuits baking was enough to make even the worst day vanish. She fussed over me in a way my mother never did, making sure my school clothes were clean, packing me lunches with little notes asking me about my teachers. For the first time, I had someone who wanted to know the little details of my day. But it was my grandfather who shaped me. He wasn't the kind of man who talked a lot about feelings. He was practical, sturdy, the kind of person who believed actions spoke louder than words. He'd grown up in a time when you didn't waste anything, and that philosophy bled into everything he did. He kept jars full of screws in the garage, bins of old tools that still worked, and shelves lined with supplies for every possible emergency. He was the kind of man who looked at a problem and immediately asked, "How do we fix this ourselves?" I'd sit out in the garage with him for hours, watching as he repaired old lawnmowers, patched up leaky hoses, or tinkered with the generator. He'd explain what he was doing step by step, even if I was too young to really understand. And every once in a while he'd pause, look at me seriously, and say, "Better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it." Those words drilled into me. At 10 years old, I didn't fully grasp their weight, but I carried them like scripture. Our neighborhood wasn't immune to storms. Every winter, the power lines would go down from heavy winds or ice, sometimes for days at a time. While the rest of the street panicked, my grandfather calmly rolled out his backup generator, filled it with the gasoline he always had stored, and kept our lights on. My grandmother cooked on the propane stove, and we stayed warm with the space heaters he'd set up. Neighbors would stop by to borrow things, and he always lent them out without hesitation. But later, when it was just us, he'd mutter, "This is why you prepare. No one ever thinks ahead." The older I got, the more I understood him. He was a man who had wanted to serve in the military during the 1960s, only to be turned away because of his eyesight and a medical issue. He never stopped regretting it, but instead of letting that defeat him, he redirected his energy into being prepared for everything else life might throw at him. I think in some ways he wanted me to inherit that mindset, to be ready for anything, to never let the world catch me off guard. And I did. His habits became my own. I started keeping a mental checklist of what we had, what we needed, and how long we could last if something went wrong. By the time I was in high school, I knew how to change out plumbing, patch drywall, refuel the generator, and store food properly. These weren't just chores, they were lessons, survival skills disguised as everyday tasks. And with each one, I felt like I was becoming more of the person he wanted me to be, rather than the mistake my father always claimed I was. Speaking of my father, my parents rarely called. When they did, it was brief, almost forced, like checking in on a distant cousin rather than their own son. I remember one Christmas they came by unexpectedly. My father looked around the house at the new paint on the walls, at the N64 plugged into the TV, at the smile on my face. And for a moment, I swear I saw jealousy in his eyes. He didn't say it outright, but I could feel it. He resented that his parents had given me what he never could. He tried to reassert authority once. He pulled me aside, put his hand on my shoulder, and told me not to get too comfortable here, that one day I'd come back to live with them because family sticks together. I remember staring at him, realizing in that instant that he had no power over me anymore. I didn't say anything back, I didn't have to. My silence was enough. He never brought it up again. My sister, meanwhile, grew up in their household, getting everything I never did. When I'd see her, she was always dressed in new clothes, bragging about the latest toy or gadget. My parents paraded her around like their pride and joy while I was the kid they left behind. And yet, I didn't envy her. I pitied her, because while she had material things, she didn't have what I had: real love, real guidance. She wasn't learning how to be strong or self-sufficient. She wasn't learning to prepare. She was learning to expect. High school was easier for me because of my grandparents. They showed up to every event, every parent-teacher conference, every game I played in. My grandfather may not have been able to play football in his youth, but he cheered louder than anyone when I played. Not because I was great at it, but because I was there trying. That was enough for him. The happiest memories of those years aren't the big milestones, they're the small ones. Saturday mornings when my grandmother made pancakes while my grandfather read the paper at the table. Evenings when the three of us sat in the living room, the dog curled at our feet, a movie playing on the TV while the fire crackled. It was ordinary, simple. But to me, it was everything I had ever wanted. And yet, in the back of my mind, there was always the shadow of my parents. They were out there, building a life without me, treating my sister as the golden child while pretending I didn't exist. Sometimes I wondered if they told people they only had one kid. Sometimes I wondered if my father still thought of me as the mistake that ruined his life. But whenever those thoughts ate at me, my grandfather's voice cut through: "Better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it." He wasn't just talking about supplies. He was talking about strength, resilience, and self-worth, and in that house I was finally learning all three. By the time I hit my 20s, I thought I was ready to take on the world. I moved out for a while, got a place of my own, and worked whatever jobs I could find. It wasn't glamorous, warehouse shifts, late night stocking, a stint at a car parts store. But I was used to hard work thanks to my grandfather. I'd learned from him that no job was beneath you if it kept food on the table and the lights on. Still, the real world had a way of humbling me. Rent ate up most of my paycheck, bills swallowed the rest, and suddenly the independence I thought I craved didn't feel so liberating. The tiny one-bedroom apartment I could barely afford was always noisy, the neighbors always fighting, and the walls paper-thin. I didn't realize how much I missed my grandparents' house until I was away from it. That place hadn't just been a home, it was stability. It was the one place in my life that never made me feel like a burden. When my grandparents started aging into their retirement years, the balance shifted. They never asked me for help, but I could see the cracks forming. My grandmother's energy wasn't what it used to be. She moved slower, got tired faster, and needed to sit down while cooking. My grandfather still had the willpower of a bull, but even bulls get old. He'd grumble about his knees, about his back, about how climbing the ladder to clean the gutters wasn't as easy as it used to be. I didn't need convincing. I packed up my life, broke my lease, and moved back in. They pretended they didn't want me to sacrifice for them, but I could see the relief in their eyes when I carried my boxes into the old familiar bedroom. And honestly, I was relieved too. I felt like I'd been drifting, and this was a way to anchor myself again. Living there as an adult was different. This time I wasn't the kid being taken care of, I was the caretaker. I started paying rent, which they resisted at first. My grandfather grumbled, "You don't need to do that, we're fine," but I knew better. Retirement savings only stretched so far, and utility bills, property taxes, and upkeep weren't cheap. I insisted, and eventually he accepted, though he still slipped cash into my jacket pocket sometimes when I wasn't looking. It wasn't long before I realized just how much my grandfather had been holding things together with sheer stubbornness. The house, though well-maintained, had problems lurking beneath the surface. The plumbing was old, the roof shingles were curling, and the paint was peeling in places. My grandfather and I became a two-man renovation crew. On weekends we'd sand walls, replace fixtures, and scrape decades of gunk out of pipes. George, the neighbor across the street, even came over a few times to help us redo the plumbing in the basement. He was an old friend of my grandfather, the kind of man who'd show up with a toolbox and a six-pack of beer. And then there was the HOA. God, the HOA. They were like vultures circling overhead, waiting for the smallest excuse to swoop down. They didn't care that the house had been lived in for decades by good people. They only cared about property values, paint shades, and grass length. Every month it seemed like a new letter showed up in the mailbox. The fence needed repainting, the trash cans had been left visible from the street, the lawn was 1 inch too tall. My grandfather would crumple the letters in his fist, muttering curses under his breath. "These people wouldn't last 2 weeks in the world I grew up in," he'd growl. To their credit, once we started the renovations, the tone shifted. After we repainted the house and redid the roof, suddenly the HOA acted like we were model residents. Smiles, nods, even the occasional compliment. I remember my grandfather shaking his head saying, "They hated us until we spent money. That's all it ever is, money." I think in his own way, he enjoyed proving them wrong, showing that he could turn the house into the best-looking one on the street, not for them but for himself. Life during those years was a strange mix of exhaustion and contentment. I worked, I helped pay bills, I took on more and more of the maintenance. But there was also a rhythm to it. Saturday mornings with my grandmother cooking while my grandfather tinkered in the garage. Evenings when we sat on the porch, watching the sun go down, drinking sweet tea and talking about nothing in particular. Sometimes my grandfather would reminisce about the past, about the Cold War, about his dream of building a bomb shelter, about how he still regretted not serving in the military. Other times he'd just sit in silence, his eyes fixed on the horizon, as if still preparing for something only he could see. And I learned from him every single day, not just how to repair a leaky pipe or keep the generator fueled, but how to carry myself with quiet resilience, how to prepare for storms, literal and figurative. Tell me, the world won't hand you anything, son. You either make do or you go without. That's life. Those words cut deeper than he probably realized, because every time I looked back on my childhood with my parents, I saw the truth of it. They had gone without not because they had to, but because they didn't prepare, didn't fight, didn't care enough to make do. And me, I was the product of their neglect, but also the living proof that I could rise above it. Looking back, I realized those years were some of the most important of my life. They weren't easy, but they forged me into someone who could stand on his own, someone who could face down storms without flinching. What I didn't know then was that they were also preparing me for the hardest storm of all, the day I would lose the only real family I had ever known. Life has a cruel way of changing without warning. One morning, my grandmother was humming in the kitchen, flipping pancakes like she had 1,000 times before. The next, she was gone. No slow decline, no drawn-out illness, just sudden silence where her laughter used to be. It felt like someone ripped the foundation out from under me. I'll never forget the phone call. I was at work when my grandfather's voice cracked through the line. He never sounded weak before, not once in my life, but that day he was broken. "She's gone," he said, 2 words, that was it. I dropped everything and drove home, hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. The house felt different the second I stepped inside. Empty, cold, my grandfather sat in his chair, staring at the wall. He didn't even look up when I came in. That's when I realized grief doesn't just hurt, it hollows you out. The funeral was small, simple, the way she would have wanted. Neighbors came, old friends showed up, and everyone had a story about how kind she was, how she'd fed them, listened to them, or helped in some quiet way. My parents didn't bother to show. They claimed they were too busy. My father had work, my mother had errands, my sister had some event she couldn't miss. It didn't surprise me, but it cut deep anyway. She may not have been their mother-in-law of choice, but she was still family. And they couldn't even give her that one final day. After she passed, my grandfather wasn't the same. He tried to pretend he was fine. He still fixed things around the house, still made his jokes about the HOA, still lectured me about stocking up on supplies, but the fire in him dimmed. It was in the way he moved slower, in how he lingered at the dining table, staring at the empty chair across from him. Nights became the hardest. I'd hear him packing the hallway or sitting on the porch long after midnight. Sometimes I'd find him with her photo in his lap, eyes red, whispering words meant only for her. We tried to keep the house alive. We repainted rooms, replaced old furniture, fixed squeaky doors. In some ways, I think he was trying to keep her spirit there by making the house shine. But grief is a weight you can't renovate away. Slowly, over the next year and a half, it pulled him down. His health started failing, aches turned into doctor visits into hospital stays. And then one morning, the house was too quiet. I went upstairs to find him still in bed, untouched breakfast waiting in the kitchen. For the first time in my life, bacon sat cold on the stove. That's when I knew he was gone too. Losing him broke me in a way I can't explain. With him gone, I felt like I'd lost not just my grandfather, but my father, my teacher, my protector. The man who taught me everything I knew about resilience, about survival, about what it meant to love someone without ever needing to say it outright. Standing in that empty room, I realized the only people who had truly cared about me were both gone now, and I was alone. But grief wasn't the only storm I had to weather. My parents, who hadn't lifted a finger to care for my grandparents, swooped in the second they smelled money. They hadn't shown up for my grandmother's funeral, but they arrived at my grandfather, dressed like it was some kind of business meeting. My sister came too, in a flashy designer dress that looked more like she was going to a nightclub than paying respects. I remember staring at her, wondering how someone could be so tone-deaf, but then I realized it wasn't about grief for them, it was about appearances. All through the service, I noticed my parents whispering to each other, stealing glances at me, their faces tight with resentment. I didn't know why at the time, but I felt it building. The answer came soon enough at the will reading. My grandfather had left everything to me. The house, the vehicles, the savings, every last possession. My parents had been disinherited long ago, and the lawyer made it clear this wasn't some last-minute change. It had been written years earlier, back when my grandparents decided they wouldn't reward neglect with inheritance. My father's face turned red as the words sank in. My mother's mouth hung open in disbelief. My sister just looked furious, as if she'd been robbed of something that had never belonged to her. That's when the storm hit. Calls, messages, letters, all saying the same thing, that I needed to do the right thing and hand everything over to my father because it was supposed to be his. My father left voicemails dripping with venom, reminding me again that I'd ruined his life and that the least I could do was give him the house he deserved. My mother called me selfish, ungrateful, heartless. My sister called me a thief. I refused. I told them all exactly what I thought in words sharp enough to cut, and then I stopped answering. That's when they decided to take it further. They sued me. I'll never forget walking into that courtroom. I was nervous, but the will was ironclad. When the judge read it, listened to the lawyer, and heard my side of the story, his face hardened. He turned to my parents and in front of everyone called my father a terrible parent. He said my grandparents had been right to disown him, that any parent who abandoned their child and treated them like a mistake had no right to expect inheritance. My father, for once in his life, had no comeback. He just hung his head in silence. I thought maybe that would be the end of it, but outside the courtroom he cornered me. He leaned in close, his voice low and venomous, and said, "You were always the biggest mistake of my life. If I could go back in time, I'd make sure you never existed. I should have been a football star, not a nobody with a name tag." I looked him dead in the eyes and told him the truth, that I never asked to be born, that his parents had seen what kind of man he was, and that he was no father of mine. Then I walked away. That was the last real conversation I ever had with him. The harassment didn't stop immediately. The calls came for months, angry, desperate, threatening. Sometimes I'd just set the phone down on the counter and let them rant into the void until they realized I wasn't listening. Sometimes I'd hang up before the first word. Letters piled up in the trash unopened. Emails went unanswered. Eventually, they stopped trying, and in that silence, I finally felt free. But freedom comes with a strange emptiness. The house was mine, the bank account too, and for the first time in my life, I had security. No debt, no looming bills, no parents trying to drag me down, just me. And yet, standing in the house my grandparents had poured their lives into, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the empty chairs at the table, the missing voices in the rooms. I had won the battle, but at what cost? I'm in my late 30s now. On paper, I've got what a lot of people my age would kill for: a paid-off house in a nice neighborhood, 2 vehicles in the driveway, both mine, a savings account that doesn't bleed dry every month, no student loans, no crushing debt, no landlord breathing down my neck. I should feel victorious. I should feel like I beat the system, like I rose above everything life threw at me. And yet, I sit in this house most nights listening to the silence, and I wonder if this is really what winning feels like. The rooms are clean, orderly, well-maintained, just the way my grandfather would have wanted. The paint is fresh, the gutters unclogged, the generator fueled. I keep his tools in the same place in the garage, the jars of screws neatly lined up on the shelves as if moving them would dishonor him. I've even kept some of my grandmother's things, her recipe cards, her framed cross-stitch hanging in the hallway, the quilt she made that still smells faintly like her perfume. It's like the house remembers them even when no one else does. But the truth is, it's quiet here, too quiet. Some nights I sit in the living room with the TV on just to drown out the stillness. Other nights I walk from room to room, flicking lights on and off, telling myself I'm checking for problems when really I'm just trying to fill the emptiness. This house was full of life once, now it's just me. I haven't really dated since high school. For years I told myself I didn't need anyone. Relationships were messy, people were unreliable, and I'd had enough of disappointment to last a lifetime. But lately the loneliness has started to creep in. It hits hardest on holidays, when neighbors gather with their families, or when I see old classmates posting pictures of their kids online. I don't envy them, but I do feel the hollow ache of what I've missed. Maybe that's why I've started thinking that if I ever do settle down, it'll probably be as a stepfather. I don't picture myself raising a baby from scratch, not because I don't think I could, but because I don't want to repeat the cycle. I want to step into someone's life and be the solid ground they can count on, the way my grandparents were for me. I think I'd be good at that. I know what it's like to be ignored, to be forgotten, to be treated like a mistake. And I know exactly how to make sure no kid ever feels that way under my roof. Sometimes I catch myself wondering what my father thinks now, all these years later. Does he still tell himself I ruined his life? Does he still look at his name tag every morning and blame me for the choices he made? I doubt he'll ever admit the truth, that he was the architect of his own misery. My mother, she's still working retail, still bitter that her glory days ended with high school. My sister, she tried modeling, got married, divorced, had kids, and now works a job she feels is beneath her. Funny how the golden child ended up with nothing golden to show for it. Meanwhile, I live in a house I didn't have to beg for, with a roof over my head that no one can take away. I didn't get it by charm or luck or inheritance alone. I got it because 2 people saw me when no one else did, because they poured into me the love my parents withheld. My grandparents gave me everything: lessons, stability, and yes, their home. But what they really gave me was proof that I wasn't a mistake. Every time I walk past their old bedroom, every time I sit on the porch where my grandfather and I used to drink sweet tea, every time I smell bacon in the pan, I remember. I remember the people who taught me that love is quiet but powerful, that preparation is survival, and that sometimes family isn't who raises you, it's who saves you. And that's the life I carry now. Not glamorous, not flashy, not filled with applause, but solid, real, a foundation built out of survival and love. I don't know what the next chapter of my life will look like. Maybe I'll find someone to share it with, maybe I'll spend it alone. But one thing I know for certain: whatever storms come, I'll be ready. Because my grandfather was right, it's better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it.